In 1851, a strong new voice joined the struggle for women's suffrage: Susan B. Anthony. An unmarried teacher and Quaker, Anthony had strong moral convictions and participated in the abolitionist movement. She and Stanton would soon become allies. At a time when most women kept their opinions to themselves, Stanton and Anthony did just the opposite. Over the next 10 years, Stanton drafted speeches, while Anthony traveled from town to town, inspiring many women to join in the struggle for women's rights.
Anthony and Stanton became public figures at a time when it was against the law for women to speak in public, so you can imagine that this was rare.
Stanton and Anthony were very popular speakers. Thousands and thousands of Americans heard them.
This was a period when a coalition of anti-slavery and women's rights advocates worked side by side to gain universal civil rights for all Americans. But their campaign, along with most everything in the United States, came to a halt in 1861 when war erupted between the North and the South, a civil war. For 4 long years, the country was torn apart as the war called into question the institution of slavery and the nation's future. And women's suffrage was put on hold. By the war's end in 1865, the country's priorities were focused on changing the Constitution to outlaw slavery.
The urgency of making sure the war ends slavery is so all-consuming that it's hard to insist that an anti-slavery movement and a women's rights movement be sort of co-equals when one of the great changes of the Western world is dawning.
Slavery in the United States was finally abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution.
A strong women's rights supporter said the door of freedom has swung open and the woman and the Negro will walk through it arm in arm. That didn't happen. The Negro man walked through by himself.
Ratified in 1866, the 14th Amendment guaranteed black men the right to vote.
The Constitution had been gender neutral until this point. It had never mentioned sex as a condition for citizenship. And now, for the first time, it did.
Putting male in the Constitution was to say it is okay for states to bar women.
Many southern states, still stinging from the abolition of slavery, passed laws to circumvent the 14th Amendment. And in response, Congress readied another amendment. This time, they would try and protect the voting rights of black men by explicitly barring discrimination on the basis of race. Suffragists pushed to get their rights included in this new 15th Amendment. They felt that this was going to be their chance. But instead of becoming a great unifying moment, it drove a wedge through the movement itself.
Out of this coalition, if you will, that had been working for women's rights and African American rights for 30 years at least, and now they were separated.
There's the group that says, let's be practical and go with the 15th Amendment, not protest it so that black men can vote. But then there was the other group who said, oh, no. We don't want the 15th Amendment to be passed because we feel that that will then throw women back many decades in getting the right to vote.
Even Frederick Douglass asked women to accept the 15th Amendment as proposed.
On top of asking the country to adjust to freedom and equality for slaves, Douglass knew good and well that they were not about to give the vote to women as well. He knew that as a practical matter, it could not happen.
Stanton, Anthony, and their followers rejected Douglass's plea. They opposed the 15th Amendment believing it was an enormous step backwards. They spent months leading petition drives and lobbying Congress. But the 15th Amendment passed as written, ignoring women.
The 15th Amendment was a terrible, terrible disappointment to them. It created one more group that was allowed into the boys' club.
After the amendment's passage, there stood two distinct branches of the suffrage movement that wanted nothing to do with each other. One branch believed that trying to change the country all at once was impractical. They decided to build support for a women's suffrage amendment by developing local support and organizations state by state. Stanton and Anthony ridiculed this strategy. As citizens of the United States, they believed that the Constitution already guaranteed women the right to vote. And to prove it in court, they urged their supporters to attempt something shocking. They should try and vote.
They were going to go to the registration booth and register to vote and say, I'm a U.S. citizen. Here's my proof I'm a citizen. I own property. Here's my proof. I'm a citizen. I pay taxes. Here's my proof. So I want the right to vote.
One activist from Missouri gave them their chance. Virginia Minor sued the government when she was turned away from the polls and managed to get her case heard before the United States Supreme Court. In 1875, the court ruled against Minor and in favor of a state's right to prohibit women from voting.
When that decision came down, it was so absolute, it was so, this case is settled now and forever, that it was clear that women would not have equal rights protected in the United States of America without a constitutional amendment.
Stanton and Anthony, especially Stanton, were incensed because black men who had been slaves in the South had gained the right to vote. And it was a very class-oriented thing. These poor, ignorant black men, they're not better than we are. We are educated white women from wholesome, good families. We should have the right to vote. How dare they want to vote and we can't vote?
Perhaps blinded by their outrage, Stanton and Anthony gave in to prejudice. Needing to attract more supporters from every part of the country to the cause, including the South, they developed alliances with socially conservative women.
Susan B. Anthony, she looks on the horizon to see who has the most power here, who can I join forces with that will bring in the greatest number.
White racist women came into the movement and began to make racist arguments for the vote. Unforgivable arguments, that you have to have educated white women to make up for the uneducated black vote. Awful.
And if you read the proceedings in the history of women's suffrage, you can see the name calling. Stanton called black women Dinah, and she called black men Sambo. You call somebody Sambo, that's almost like using the N-word, especially in the 19th century.
Anthony and Stanton's single-minded devotion to the cause of votes for women led them to make these questionable choices. They didn't consider themselves racist. They believed they were merely being pragmatic. And pragmatism eventually had its benefits. In 1890, they put aside their differences with other suffrage leaders, and the fractured movement reunited to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. The cause of women's suffrage was reborn with new purpose, direction, and a new generation of women.
The second generation of suffragists were different human beings because the first generation of suffragists created a different world that they would inhabit. They created a world in which their daughters had a sense of their own worth.
These more modern